Churches in England are often portrayed as quaint, picturesque centres of their community. But given they're often also one of the oldest buildings in a town or village, it's hardly surprising that we'd have so many tales of haunted churches too. Some of these tales immortalise previous parishioners, but more usually, the tales commemorate dark deeds or criminal activity. And why not? Just look at the brutal murder of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. And then there's the widespread desecration of churches during the Reformation and the tumultuous period afterwards. So let's explore some of the tales behind England's haunted churches, including phantoms from the future, ghostly birds, spectral organ music and lights in the churchyard, in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I certainly hope that your February is treating you a little bit better than the month has been treating me. So there we go. I'm not going to get into personal details, but suffice it to say, I shall be doing my adventures on my own for the foreseeable future. And also, I do apologise if there's any weird noise in the background, because I'm having a morning where it seems like it doesn't matter what I do, some kind of noise goes on in the background. And the airport near me is really, really noisy, and I'm pretty sure a military jet just went over. And they're not exactly quiet, so I do apologise for any peculiar, extraneous background noise. I've done my best to try and minimise it, but you never know, it might end up in there anyway, so we'll just see how we get on. So we are finishing off the theme of the folklore of specific buildings, which did obviously just end up being pubs and churches, but there we go. And this week we're going to be having a look at haunted churches. So obviously last week we looked at the legends of like architectural oddities and how folklore explains things like that. But this week we're very much going to look at specifics around ghosts in churches. And I was actually quite surprised quite how many haunted churches there seems to be. Now, we aren't going to be looking at any of the cathedrals or abbeys and things like that, because I have done tales of ghostly monks before, but this is going to be essentially like the smaller parish churches. So that's what exactly what I'm talking about when I say churches. So we're going to start off with a crossover with the St. Mark's Eve Divination that we saw last week. And just in case you haven't listened to that episode yet, this involves people sitting in the church porch on the 24th of April between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. to see a procession of those who are going to die in the following year. This pops up again in a couple of the haunted church stories, and in one of them, a new vicar arrived in Derwent Woodlands in Derbyshire and was none too pleased to discover the tradition of the sermon for the dead. Now, this involved preaching a sermon in the empty church on the last Sunday in December at midnight, and according to this particular tradition, all those who would die in the following year would appear as wraiths to hear the sermon. Now, this obviously didn't sit well with the vicar, who basically dismissed it as folk magic, and he absolutely refused to preach the sermon. And he refused, and he refused, and he refused, right up until the point that he had to give it, and then he found himself giving the sermon anyway. And to his horror, while he's delivering this sermon to this apparently empty church, a bunch of spectres then gathered in the gallery, and he spotted himself among the spectres listening quietly, and true to the story, the vicar died within the year. Now, a similar tale from Walton le Dale in Lancashire saw a new vicar arrive in the village to preach at St Leonard's, and some believed that his interest ran a little too close to the dark arts for their liking, and he also befriended the village astrologer. Now, the vicar and the astrologer decided to keep a vigil in the church porch, only for the vicar to see himself among the ghostly procession. Later that year, he caught a fever from a parishioner and died, so he got a little bit of a similarity there. But the difference is this new character of the astrologer, and people speculated that the story was actually linked with Edward Kelly, the medium who'd worked with Dr. John Dee, and he'd apparently experimented with necromancy in the area to ascertain when a specific person would die. And some people say that Dee was actually present during the rite at St Leonard's, and obviously there is an episode about necromancy which I've linked below in the show notes. Now, other people find this connection fairly irrelevant due to the commonality of the vigil stories, but I think what's quite interesting is it's sometimes quite difficult to find the name of the person who sees the vision of themselves and then dies. So you're like, is this just your version of an urban legend, or is it actually true? So that's one of the things that I think we do need to bear in mind. Now, we are going to go on to spectral music because I love any stories about kind of ghostly sounds more than visions, I think, because obviously sounds are a little bit harder in a lot of ways to sort of imagine, I think, and particularly music, sort of that feels like it should have a slightly more tangible origin. And St Mary's Church in Evenbree, Herefordshire, was reputed to be haunted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And basically, people were hearing organ music coming from the church when the church was actually empty. Now, one married couple was coming home in the snow on Christmas Day in around about the 1880s, and they decided to take shelter in the porch to try and wait out the storm. And while they were standing there, they actually heard all kinds of happy and joyful human sounds coming from inside the church. But then when they tried the church door to sort of go inside and see what was happening, it was actually locked, and the church itself was in darkness. Now, the woman who actually wrote to the vicar to tell him the story stressed how uplifting she'd found the experience, which is really interesting, and it seems completely at odds with the usual terror associated with ghost stories. And it does seem that a lot of this seems to come back to the church's organist. And if you believe the main legend, he was quite a good and popular man in the village. Unfortunately, the same could not be said of his brother, who continually leeched off the organist. And one night it all came to a head and the brothers came to blows on a bridge and the bad brother killed the good one. Following this particular incident, people then heard the organ being played in the empty church. Now, according to some versions of the legend, the vicar apparently did an exorcism on the bridge at the time the murder happened, and while the music did continue, it took on a less painful tone. I should point out that the church actually closed in 1931 and is nothing more than a ruin now. Except this tale gets a lot more interesting because I was looking on British newspaper archives and I found that in 1919, the vicar at the time, E.H. Archer Shepherd, had actually written a letter to the Bromyard News to categorically deny laying any ghosts to rest. And as he wrote, and I quote, "I believe neither in ghostly manifestations nor in the efficacy of any number of lighted candles to lay a ghost," end quote. Because a lot of the stories kept saying, oh, he lays the ghost to rest with 12 candles every year. And he's just like, no, doesn't happen. Now, the vicar refused to believe that a disembodied spirit would actually be able to muster the strength required to play an organ. And he did admit that many people had heard the phantom organ music, but he believed, and I quote, "Some telepathic or autosuggestive or atmospheric or other natural cause may have acted on our auditory nerves, setting up sensations which were transmuted by the brain into external sounds," end quote. So he basically is just like, no, I don't believe this is happening. But another theory was actually that a man named Nicholas Vaughan had burned down the palace of the Bishop of Hereford, and according to this legend, Vaughan is the one haunting the church, not the organist, though in all honesty it doesn't really explain why there's organ music, and it also doesn't explain why this arsonist would then be hanging out in a church. So who knows what's actually going on in Evenbree. We're going to move on to a haunted church in London now, which is quite cool. And obviously one of my favourite churches in London is always going to be St Bride's, and I do highly recommend people popping in to visit. But this one is St James Garlick Hythe, which stands on London's Garlick Hill. And according to legend, a grey figure who crosses its hands over its chest haunts the church, and the spectre stands in the corner staring at the altar. Now, weirdly, the legend has only really existed for about 150 years or so, although there is potentially an explanation for this. Now, the figure is known as Jimmy Garlick and is actually linked to a naturally mummified corpse found in 1830 during excavation work in the chancel. Now, the Great Fire had gutted the building, which destroyed the record, so there's no way to know who the corpse might be, but it does seem rather apt that the legend only dates to the discovery of the corpse. And some felt that the ghost only began to haunt the church in protest at the mummy being put on display and people were paying to see it. Now, various theories do abound as to who the figure is, including Dick Whittington, who obviously we met a few episodes ago. And the sightings of a phantom cat in the church also seem to lend weight to this theory. But when Mummy Autopsy examined Jimmy in 2004, they think that he died between 1641 and 1801 and also had osteoarthritis, making it likely he was an older man. And this seems to put paid to some of the ideas about him having been a sailor who died on a boat in the docks nearby. Now, a glass case once held the mummy, but a bomb shattered the glass during an air raid in 1942. And according to one legend, locals saw a shrouded man in the church before any air raids. In one raid, a fireman actually dashed into the church to rescue a man who refused to leave before he faded from sight. Now, however, the mummy lies in storage in the tower, but it would be quite interesting if anybody has been in St James Garlick Hythe or it can actually pop in if you go and have a look and see if Jimmy Garlick appears when you're there, because that would be quite cool to know. Now, so far we've looked at these kind of strange apparitions and ghostly music and so on, but there is always the possibility that some tales of ghosts can mask other activity. So look at the tales of phantom coaches that we looked at, in which some people believed that the stories were intended to hide the activities of smugglers. And obviously churches weren't immune to this either. And people regularly reported seeing ghosts in the churchyard in Lower Gornal in Staffordshire. And according to the legend, in 1879, a would-be assassin badly injured the Reverend J.Y. Rooker on the 8th of August. And it seemed that the assassin, one Charles Hartland, had twice been brought before Rooker in his role as a magistrate and twice been convicted. So it does rather seem that Hartland was after some kind of revenge. Now, he shot Rooker in the ear, neck and mouth, and yet somehow Rooker survived. Some people claimed that they'd seen Hartland lurking in the churchyard, but then other people came out with these strange stories about figures walking in the field between the vicarage and the churchyard. And the police investigated but could find no evidence of mischief. But eventually, with the build-up of the stories, people refused to go near the churchyard after dark. And other locals then decided that the problem was indeed assassins, and they pledged to guard the vicar and held vigils outside his house. Now, this actually led to several skirmishes between locals who often didn't or couldn't recognise one another in the dark. And when you read the stories about it, it does all seem a little bit like some kind of weird Benny Hill comedy sketch. Now, no one is entirely sure if this was a hoax that went badly wrong or if it was a deliberate persecution of the vicar. Now, the villagers ultimately blamed ghosts for it all, so much so that one woman actually suggested an exorcism. Now, most exorcisms tend to have a little bit of drama attached to them, but the version she wanted to do meant that she wanted permission to cut a 4-inch square of turf from a particular grave. And according to her, this particular grave belonged to a young man whose guilty conscience meant that he couldn't rest easily in his grave. So she claimed that if they took the turf and then they put it under the communion table for 4 days, this would lay all of the ghosts to rest. Sadly, there is no record as to whether they actually tried this or not, but it does appear that the ghost stories do seem to eventually fade away, so perhaps it worked, who knows. And elsewhere, the criminals themselves could actually become ghosts, pestering those trying to use the church. And in 1749, the locals became convinced that the vaults beneath St Martin's Church in West Drayton, Buckinghamshire, were haunted. People were reporting hearing strange noises, and there were knockings, and it was all just a little bit of a strange place to be. And a handful of brave people even peered through a ventilation grate into one of the vaults and spotted a raven perched on a coffin. Other people saw the raven in the church itself, where it was chased by a group of men who found it in the rafters, and they beat it so badly that they actually broke one of its wings, but it apparently vanished before them. And people continued to see it throughout the church for some time later, but it always vanished before anyone could grab it. And obviously, if you are interested in ravens and folklore, then I do have a special episode about them for Patreon supporters, so you can check that out in the link in the show notes. Now, people were still speaking about this phantom raven in 1883 when people reported hearing phantom flutterings in the church. And they believed the raven to be the spirit of a murderer who'd committed suicide, but who was buried in consecrated ground rather than at the crossroads as customs dictated at the time. So obviously that would therefore mean that the murderer couldn't rest easily and had somehow then decided to take the form of a raven. Now, another theory explored the idea that a murderer and their victim had been buried side by side in the vault, and such close proximity meant that their spirits couldn't rest, and many believed the raven to be the soul of the murderer. I should point out as well that the raven was usually seen on Fridays, which was considered to be a particularly unlucky day. It is quite difficult to sort of really get to the bottom of who was in these vaults, and because you would think there would be records and so on. So it is quite difficult to work out what the raven has to do with anything, but it's really interesting that the ghost in this particular tale seems to take animal form rather than human form, and I suppose it also picked a rather ominous creature as well in the form of a raven, because I don't think you'd be quite as bothered if that was a sparrow or something like that, or indeed a dove, but ravens have such negative connotations, and unfairly so in my opinion, that I think that's what lends weight to that particular ghost story. And our final ghost story is an interesting one, because the ghost element kind of happens before there's actually any supernatural activity, if that makes sense. And this one is my hometown, Newcastle upon Tyne, And we had a cholera epidemic in 1853 that was particularly bad. And after that, the authorities banned burials in the parish churchyards on sanitary grounds. Now, this was a problem for John Alderson, who was the beadle at All Saints Church, and that is the one that you can see from the quay side, if you know Newcastle particularly well. Now, Alderson couldn't make money if he didn't have graves to dig, so he came up with a plan. He was going to open existing graves, steal the lead from the coffins, and then sell that on, and that was going to make up the shortfall for what he wasn't being paid for digging graves. And it seemed like genius, especially because his lantern could be seen in nearby Silver Street, so locals assumed that supernatural shenanigans were afoot and steered clear. So again, it's a little bit like those phantom coach stories where if you say that there's a ghost, people then won't go and investigate, and therefore you can pretty much do what you want in the darkness. Now, all of this seemed like it was going quite well, but eventually the plan came to a screeching halt because somebody was like, hang on a minute, this isn't quite right. And nobody really knows if somebody had suddenly realised that Alderson had more money than he should do, or if somebody had indeed perhaps seen him. But either way, someone ordered an investigation and a watch was set, and Alderson was caught red-handed. So in July 1854, he was found guilty of opening graves and stealing the lead from the coffins. And according to the Newcastle Guardian, Alderson broke open no less than 5 vaults, reporting that, and I quote, 9 leaden coffins enclosing shells in which dead bodies were deposited had been forcibly removed, end quote. So it's not quite so much as the fact he's opening graves, he's essentially desecrating coffins as well. And the newspaper explained that Alderson sold the lead for whatever could be procured for it. And the report also goes to great pains to explain the ghastly spectacle presented by the opened coffins and the deadly stench coming from the vaults, making the crime all the more heinous. Now, Alderson, along with his wife and mother, faced 18 months imprisonment, and his bellringer and accomplice, Hewison Marshall, received 12 months. Alderson also then became known as Jack the Bad Beadle, and some say that you can still see his lantern bobbing around in the darkness of the churchyard. So what do we make of all these haunted churches? Well, as we found with pubs a few weeks ago, old gathering places seem to continue to gather legends over time, and perhaps the sites that see the most human activity ultimately find themselves imprinted with the influence of those that used them. And obviously the link between churches and burial places is clear to see, with people interred within the church or buried close by. And while it's more likely that a spectre would haunt where they had lived rather than where they were buried, it's understandable to imagine seeing phantoms when you're surrounded by the dead. And I think the other thing that we do have to bear in mind is there is this kind of juxtaposition between a holy space and some kind of return of the dead as well. So it is quite interesting that a lot of these stories were being written about in the 19th century, so they do appear in newspapers, and obviously a lot of them were related in The Law of the Land by Jacqueline Simpson and Jennifer Westwood, so they're obviously important enough to pop up. And in some cases appear on the church's own website. So the St James Garlick Hythe one, they talk about Jimmy Garlick and his mummy quite extensively on their website, and you can actually see a photograph of the mummy on the website as well, if indeed that is your kind of thing. I personally quite like this juxtaposition of peaceful and quiet, tranquil place with the shades of the dead still lurking around. And I think when you add into that all the church-based divination, it's kind of hardly surprising that you'd end up with this link in the public consciousness. But anyway, I would love it if you could tell me if you know about any haunted churches in your area. Please do feel free to let me know. You can always post a comment on the blog post that this episode is attached to, and the link for that is in the show notes, or you can always tweet me as well, and that's at AC Sedgwick. Sedgwick spelled Sedgwick, and it would be lovely to hear from you. As I said last week, the special bonus episode for Patreon supporters this month is all about the myths and legends associated with Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, which is a fabulous place to visit. So if you are interested in getting access to that, have a look at the link below where it sort of says about the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon, and it would be lovely to welcome you into the family. Other than that, I hope that you've enjoyed this particular theme in February. We are moving on to all things floral and plants and so on next week, because obviously we are going into March, and that's kind of when we're starting to see a few more incidents of flowers and spring returning and so on. But other than that, I hope you have a lovely week ahead, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.